Hello, John.
Hey, George. Happy New Year.
Hey, Happy New Year. So how was yours?
Mine was
and your
okay.
Christmas? It's been a few weeks.
Yeah, I had a good Christmas. Spent the day with my kids and our dog Merlin. We took a walk. It was very pleasant. Had a nice, relaxing New Year's Eve. I've never been big for New Year's Eve, so I didn't even make it until midnight this year. But
I didn't either. Isn't that terrible? I really dislike New Year's Eve.
We're just reinforcing our reputations as boring old farts, George.
I have one excuse. Is on the 31st, we got back, early evening on the 31st from the Caribbean, where we spent Christmas.
Uh-huh.
So that was very fun.
Wow.
Never done something like that before.
Where in the Caribbean did you go?
The British Virgin Islands, mostly.
Let's see. Is that St. John's or what?
No, St. John's is American Virgin Islands. So we flew into Charlotte, Amalie, which is the capital. And it was great. You palm trees with Christmas lights and things. Mm-hmm. And this great youth steel pan band, playing steel drum Christmas music down in the town square. That was kind of my favorite part. And then we took a ferry to Tortola, which is the main island in the British Virgin Islands, where my brother-in-law has a sailboat docked. So that was the attraction. Once we got there, we could join him and his wife sailing around for a week, which is what we did.
Oh, God, that sounds so great.
Well, it was interesting. I've never been to the Caribbean, and, one thing that really struck me is how beautiful it is from the water, and also the towns and the islands and the interior, but how few people actually see that. They just all, they just all basically hop from island to island on these boats, so they just see things across the water, and you spend all your time in these marinas that could just as easily be in Orange County, California, or the Hamptons.
I remember I actually spent some time in my youth, right when I was out of high school, and I was doing the hippie thing of traveling around aimlessly. I spent a winter in St. Thomas. With a friend of mine, and I actually got a job in a tourist shop and got to know a bunch of the locals. And even back then, there was a really serious, tense divide between the black locals and all the white tourists and hippies and others who were just there for fun.
It's a difficult situation. I just realized I misspoke and said that we flew into St. John when we flew into St. Thomas, which is where Charlotte Amalie is. And St. John is just a ferry hop from there.
Yeah, I can't imagine what St. Thomas is like now, because even back this was 1972, it was very heavily developed.
Oh, yeah.
And the slums were awful. So there was a little core of the town that was for tourists with all the nice hotels and so forth.
Right.
It served all the people getting off the big tour boats also. But then you just walk a couple blocks beyond that, and you're in really squalid slums.
Yeah.
And those places would be quite dangerous. So if it was bad back then, I would imagine that it's even worse.
Yeah, and I don't know. I didn't see the slums in St. Thomas. So I just kept trying to see where real people lived, and it's very difficult to. You're just really kind of cordoned off, and we had little time before we had to catch the ferry. And then on Tortola, where we were staying in this marina that looked like something in Newport Beach, and with the open air restaurants and the dive shops, and then after sailing around the islands, I just really, we went to all these places like the Bitter End Yacht Club, or we went by, Richard Branson owns an island in the northern part of the British Virgin Islands that he rents out for $35,000 a night.
Wow.
With a 3-night minimum.
Uh-huh.
And he's bought another island there. And just going through the bays and the sounds, and we were going on something called Drake's Passage, and all these islands are so beautiful, and then you get up close and you see these zigzag Zorro-like road scars because they must not have much in the way of restrictions on hilltop development because they just chopped these mansions into the sides of these hills. So when we got back to Tortola, I just really wanted to see something real. So we called a taxi and asked him to take us into Road Town, which is the capital of BVI. And the first thing, we kind of tried to do the same in Charlotte Amalie, and the first thing the taxi driver says when you say you want to go to the center of downtown, he goes, "Oh, for shopping?"
Yeah.
And he assumes you want to go to these shopping malls that sell, duty-free Rolexes and things like that. We said, no, we actually want to learn something about the history. And then this happened twice. The taxi driver just really lights up, and just starts telling me all this stuff. And, and we went to some really interesting museums and saw this, kind of interesting museums of the colonial period when, both British and then Danish. And, but just talk about an unsustainable environment. I mean, all these people like Richard Branson are talking about, this is the guy that owns Virgin Airlines and Virgin Mobile. And here in New Mexico, he's started Virgin Galactic. Well, it's not based here, but this is where the space base is going to be for outer space tourism.
Right.
So he's talking.
I've been reading some of the coverage of that. Is that for real?
Yeah. It's supposed to be, and I think they're talking about sometime in the next year or two having the first flights. But this is suborbital, flights. Right. It's not like they're going that far, and it's going to cost, 100,000 or hundreds of thousands a ticket. So, playgrounds for rich people.
Right.
But
well, it's nice to know that there are some fabulously wealthy people out there.
There apparently still are, and you can see, though, that some of these development projects look like they've been stopped in their tracks, probably when they ran out of financing.
Did you do
but this
any...
whole sustained... I'm sorry, I just wanted to finish one thread of it. So Branson bought this place called Mosquito Island, and he's also going to develop into a so-called eco-friendly, zero-carbon footprint resort.
Right.
And, an example of how these things work, like I looked up some information on Tortola, and just started asking people, like, where does the electricity comes from? Turns out the whole island, which only has 29,000 people living there, but, hundreds of thousands pass through every year on their yachts and sailboats. So the whole island is powered by a big diesel generating plant.
Uh-huh.
And next to the diesel generating plant is a desalination plant, which is, sucks up a huge amount of that energy to desalinate seawater. Yeah. And that's where they get all the fresh water on the island.
Really?
It's something like, 1.5 cents a gallon. There's no real natural water source except for rain catchment, which is...
I wonder if that's very recent. Actually, when I went down to St. Thomas in 1972, the friend that I was staying with had a job on a big water tanker that delivered fresh water.
Water.
Yeah, that delivered water to a lot of the islands. I wonder if the desalination plants have replaced that water delivery system.
Well, I'm not sure how much of the water they might, load onto tankers and deliver to some of the other islands either.
Yeah.
Be interesting to look into. But, I just know about Tortola. And the third thing that struck me is, like, one of the first things you notice when you get to this, beautiful Orange County-like marina, there was this sign that said, fuel, ice, garbage. And for $2 a bag, they take your garbage off your boat.
Wow.
And then it turns out that all this huge amount of refuse is hauled just around the end of the island to the same place where the diesel electric generator and the gravel quarry and the desalination plant are, and it's incinerated.
And does it generate power?
No. It just generates smoke.
Oh, okay.
So they actually were taken to international court, apparently, by the American Virgin Islands for all the pollution from burning all this trash. And then the country's, promoting itself as, this beautiful, eco-friendly, the natural life in the islands. It was very eye-opening.
God, George, leave it to you to take this wonderful vacation and to spend your time digging into the seamy underside of the...
I wrote about it on my Santa Fe Review blog. If anyone cares to So, but I also had a great time. I mean, boy, being out on the water, and I'd never been sailing before. And my brother-in-law, who's by profession a nuclear engineer, is, these engineers just really get into sailing because they understand all the vectors, and that part was really quite great.
I just have to ask you, did you do any skin diving or snorkeling?
Well, no. I tried to go snorkeling once, and I'd never gone snorkeling before, and I just, I had to put on these big duck feet and the snorkeling breathing apparatus and things, and it just, I don't know, it wasn't my kind of thing. So I missed out on that.
The reason I ask is because that would have given you the opportunity to discover one more depressing fact about the Caribbean, which is the death of the coral reefs.
Oh, right,
which used to be one of the main attractions for those islands. But I think we actually had a Blogging Heads, one of our first ones, almost 3 years ago, right after my family and I had been to St. Croix. And it was really hard to find good coral gardens there because so much of it had been died off, which is a global problem now.
Wow. So, there's places really, there's just too much human activity focused there, I think. But I did get a cool pirate's hat.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's actually a baseball cap that I'm wearing right now that has a skull and crossbones. It's for another big British Virgin Islands conglomerate called Pussers.
Uh-huh.
They have these stores in the marinas, and Pussers, it turns out, is owned by this guy who, a couple of decades ago, he bought the recipe that the British Navy used for their rum. Their distilling recipe, I guess. Mm-hmm. And this was after the British Navy stopped supplying rations of grog to the sailors, to keep them docile enough from revolting. And so he started marketing Pusser's rum, and then he started this whole all this spin-off with the store that sells, like cheesy hats like I bought and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So
good. I'm glad you to know that you at least played the role of a tourist to some extent.
Oh, yeah. We had some really, really nice dinners, and it was nice just sitting on the boat and, watching the scenery glide by.
Well, since you're wearing, you just explained what you're wearing, I should tell you that I've got my own costume today. I'm trying to show it for the viewers. Have you seen the ads for these things called Snuggies?
I'm not sure.
It's the latest really obnoxious infomercial. A Snuggie is a kind of poncho that you're supposed to wear for the ultimate lounging comfort. And so it's basically got a hole. It's got these really long arms, which I'm holding in front of me, that that cover your hands. You only stick your hands out if you actually need to use them. And it's for, watching TV or whatever. And they've got these ads that show families just having tons of fun, all wearing their Snuggies, either lying around in the living room or even at barbecues. And so that, the idea is that whatever you're doing, you're going to have more fun if you're in a Snuggie. And so,
does it work?
Well, actually, it is incredibly comfortable, although it's kind of weird that it's like a hospital gown. It's open in the back, which is a little strange, but that's because you're supposed to be lying down, so your back would be covered. But I bought,
so it's fun things you can do lying down.
Well, yes, that's true. So I bought these for my kids as Christmas presents because I thought they'd be so nerdy that they'd be cool, and apparently this has happened. Snuggies have become very popular among young people, but my son, I haven't been able to get him to wear his Snuggie yet, so I just kept it and decided that I would wear it today because actually it's snowing outside. It's very wintry, so it's a Snuggie kind of day.
11 degrees Fahrenheit here in Santa Fe.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's is that a record?
Well, no, it's pretty cold though. I mean, usually in January, it wouldn't be surprising for it to get down to 11 at night, but it's already midway through the morning here. So yeah, it's pretty cold, and it's kind of depressing too, because we had some big snows before the first of the year, and they're like half melted and turned to ice, and yeah, it's kind of hard coming back from the Caribbean to that, but.
Yeah, it's been a sort of a weird winter so far. This is I'm sure causing even more public relations problems for the global warming hardcore. I just talked to my brother-in-law down in Florida a couple of days ago, and he said it was in the mid-20s there.
Yeah.
Which apparently is either a record or very close to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, what it is from day to day or year to year is not really the point. But
just keep saying that, George.
Try to tell that to the public.
That's right.
So global warming. We were going to talk about, there was something. Oh, I know. Nathan Myhrvold.
Nathan Myhrvold, yes.
You want to say what that's about? It's
Nathan
sure. Myhrvold, the Microsoft gurus or ex-Microsoft gurus solution. Or possible solution to global warming.
Yeah, so Myhrvold now has this kind of an invention factory out in Washington. So he's left Microsoft, but he's still doing very well, buying up patents, and he's hired people to produce even more patents, and he gets other people to, I guess, buy licenses for some of the patents that he owns in key technology areas. But lately, and I guess this is something that his group out there has developed, he's been promoting this scheme for countering global warming by spewing large amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Excuse me, I've got a little cold. I got to blow my nose here. There we go. Just adds to the realism.
I sneezed earlier. This will be the cold edition.
We're really in character here. So somebody sent me a link to this interview with Fareed Zakaria. Zakaria interviewed Myhrvold, and Myhrvold talked
I watched that after
scheme.
You sent me the link.
And what I thought weird was that there was this prologue to the interview, which established that Myhrvold is maybe one of the most brilliant people on the planet, or made that claim.
Yeah, it's possible.
And then Myhrvold started talking, and to me he sounded like a kind of big-brained but somewhat irresponsible child, promoting this scheme that had been very, very poorly thought through. And the problem is that this has become, this idea of his has actually become quite popular. It's promoted in the book Super Freakonomics, which is part 2 of the previous bestseller, Freakonomics. So he's getting a lot of attention for this thing, and there are some really severe problems with it.
Yeah, this all kind of falls under the rubric of geoengineering solutions, right? I mean, basically, there's a number of people, I think, who've suggested that you could introduce some kind of aerosols like sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and this will reflect some of the sunlight, and this will counter some of the global warming, but won't do anything about the acidification of the fresh water and things. But yeah, and also, I mean, there's these other solutions. Was that Freeman Dyson that we talked about, who was talking about putting the big mirrors in space to reflect some of the sun away from us?
Right.
It's like on Mr. Burns on The Simpsons, when he develops this big machine to blot out the sun so it's shady all the time, so no one tries to develop solar power in Springfield.
That's right. I think Mr. Burns is a good analogy to bring up in the context of these gigantic geoengineering schemes. It also reminds me of some of the wacky ideas that Edward Teller had back in the 50s for sculpting the Earth on a grand scale with hydrogen bombs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah.
So we're already running. The whole problem with global warming is that we're basically running this gigantic experiment on the Earth, its climate, the oceans, and so forth. And we don't really know. We don't have a good idea what's going to happen, but there seems to be a very high probability of negative consequences, at least in certain parts of the globe. And so to counter that, we're going to just start other gigantic experiments with their own unintended and almost certainly negative, at least in some respects, consequences.
Well, it's kind of what we've been doing all along, though, isn't it? I mean, really in the late 1900s, when Malthus predicted that we were going to run out of enough agricultural output to support an exponentially expanding population. And he was actually right. I mean, people make fun of him now, but we've talked about this before. The reason that there's as many people alive as there are today is because of developing this Haber-Bosch process of being able to take nitrogen in the form of N2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into usable nitrogen, that can be used to fertilize crops. And without that, it's been estimated that we could support maybe a third less, like 2 or 3 billion people less than we do now on the Earth. Mm-hmm. So, that was kind of like, you could look at that as a geoengineering kind of solution. So I guess the thought is that something like that could, at least buy us a few more centuries on global warming.
So just to go back to the sulfur dioxide problem. So the obvious problems are, one of the most successful global environmental treaties ever. Well, there have been two. One to protect the ozone layer in the stratosphere. That limited chlorine, chlorofluoro, whatever.
Chlorofluorocarbons. Chlorofluorocarbons, right.
CFCs.
CFCs, right.
And then we also had successful legislation to reduce the emissions that cause acid rain back in the 80s. Yeah. Acid rain is primarily caused by sulfur dioxide.
Yeah,
so two of the effects of spewing sulfur dioxide, one of the obvious one is creating acid rain and raising the acidity of the oceans, which is already happening, is already having catastrophic consequences, including
the coral reefs, right?
But the other problem is that apparently sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere also will damage the ozone layer. Which we have helped to patch up over the last 20 years because of limiting CFC emissions.
So we need a Band-Aid to put on top of the Band-Aid.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so now then there are other people who say, but we can dump tons of lime or other bases into the ocean to counter the... I mean, it's crazy. Now, it's not to say that there really is any solution to global warming. I think Mervold was right when he said that, to some extent, the processes that we've unleashed that are causing global warming can't really be stopped. That there's so much carbon in the atmosphere now that global temperatures would continue to increase even if we radically curtail.
Even if it could stop tomorrow. Yeah. Well, to the extent, the argument that it's just part and parcel of living in an economically developed world, and it made perfect sense to exploit coal as being the number one energy source because it's so cheap and abundant, and it's really hard to go back on that now. But just lots of little solutions.
Right. I'm still hoping for.
We started talking last time about that New Yorker piece by what's the writer's name?
Not the doctor.
The health one where he was.
Gawande.
Gawande, I told Gawande, and the idea of solving healthcare, like with global warming, just suggesting all of these little experiments that you try and these little ideas and get these all out there and just kind of try to slowly put things back towards some kind of more better equilibrium.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's not going to be one big solution. Speaking of which, just after seeing that Meerwald interview and Googling around a little, I found what I think may be the best thing I've seen so far, just laying out the whole global warming, climate change debate. It was in Chemical and Engineering News. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be hard for either side in the debate to, dismiss this as this horribly biased radical journal, political journal. It's this article by Stephen K. Ritter, and it's just called Global Warming and Climate Change. And to me, it just does a great job, even better than that chart I mentioned last time, and just laying out the arguments back and forth, and mostly coming out on the side of the consensus, which is that there definitely is this phenomenon that we need to address. But
you realize, of course, George, that as soon as you say, and this happened last time when you cited that chart that you thought really laid out the issues very clearly, and then you get the commenters on Blogging Heads TV who vehemently reject your perspective and the perspective of these sources that you cite, that the consensus is valid and so forth.
Well, that's inevitable, I guess. But
I guess
this article particularly just really makes you see where both sides are coming from at a level that I haven't seen all in one place anyway.
Link to it. We'll see. Maybe this could be the tipping point in this debate, George, where people finally accept the rational, empirical truth.
Because of this article in Chemical and Engineering News.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Hey,
is there anything new we can talk about?
Well, I collected a bunch of, remember some months ago I thought we needed to talk about sex more on Blogging Heads TV because in a pathetic attempt to boost our ratings. Well,
we
going
tried
back
that,
to that.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is kind of a trend that I've noticed recently on scientific attempts to do something about our lousy sex lives. Both men and women, but I think particularly women lately, because Viagra, Cialis, the anti-impotence drugs, which of course are used not just by men who can't get an erection at all, but by perfectly healthy men who just want to enhance their erections. These have made tons of money for the pharmaceutical companies and have become extremely popular with men. So then the question is, well, what do we do about women? So women, of course, are faced with these hordes of horny husbands and boyfriends, and they're trying to beat them off with a stick, but then drug companies are saying, no, hey, we've got drugs or potions or whatever for you too. So I've just seen a bunch of these stories recently. The Times has been covering this pretty closely. Mm-hmm. Here's one from November by Michael Weinrip, In Search of Their Own Elixir of Love, and it's about these older women who are taking various drugs, and in one case a topical product called Zestra that I guess you apply to the genitalia that makes you more easily aroused. There is a drug that the Economist reported on recently called flibanserin. It makes me think of flubber, which doesn't seem very, sexy. But flibanserin, which is supposed to treat what's called acquired hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is the name. Can you believe that?
Acquired hypersexual.
Yeah,
disorder.
For women who just aren't, just don't want to get laid. And let's see, there's
was it hypo?
Hypo.
Oh,
hypo.
I thought you said hyper.
No, hypo.
hyper. Yeah, hyper. I was going to ask how that's different from nymphomania.
Right.
So this is like inverse nymphomania.
Apparently, nymphomania is not a huge problem these days. And then there is even a guy. This goes back a ways. There's a guy who is trying to market a device, and the name makes me wonder a little bit about how serious it is. It's called the Orgasmatron.
Wait, where have I heard that?
Yeah, it's after the old Woody Allen, the device in the Woody Allen movie, and this is a doctor in North Carolina, Stuart Malloy, who said that he was testing implants that involve sticking electrodes into the spinal cord to relieve chronic pain, and he found that some female patients were reporting pleasurable sensations in their sex organs. And so he's been trying to market this thing ever since. So, this is for, I guess, if you are really determined to have better orgasm or an orgasm at all, then you get surgery to have things stuck in your spinal column, and then I guess you can press a button, and I don't see why. So most of these things are supposed to involve improving sexual relations. I don't see, if you get the Orgasmatron, it doesn't seem to me that you would need anybody else. But here's just another weird thing. It turns out, do you remember the G-spot?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that was like a 1980s... Yeah, I mean, there was a big book called The G-Spot, and it said all, covers in the news magazines and things.
Yeah, and it was supposed to be this, I guess, a little lump of nerves in the vagina that, when stimulated, would give super orgasms or something like that. Anyway, there's a new study, and listen to this. This is in the London Times. Only the British can write headlines like this. The headline says, "What an anticlimax. G-spot is a myth." And it reports on this is such a weird study. A study of 1,804 British women aged 23 to 83, and they're all identical twins. And the assumption was that if one twin reported having G-spot experiences, then the other twin should as well. But this study found no correlation. About half of the women in the study reported feeling like they had a G-spot, and that it worked for them. But there was no correlation. They figured that if one identical twin had the G-spot, the other one should too.
If it was some actual physiological.
Right.
Yeah,
so the conclusion was that it's a subjective thing. Some women have convinced themselves that they have this thing, but there is apparently the people who are associated with the G-spots are fighting back, and so Beverly Whipple, she's at Rutgers and helped to popularize the G-spot. She says that the research was flawed and said that they didn't properly. So I guess they also some of the research involved anecdotal reports about sexual experiences, and she said that the type of sex that these women were having wasn't the right sex to activate the G-spot. And I won't. I don't know if I should go into the details about what kind of sex. I guess I shouldn't.
Nah, we gotta hold up our standards here.
Right.
There's a new biography of Masters and Johnson that just came out.
Really?
Yeah.
Who were sort of
think of all this?
I guess I've read about them before that they were, even though they had wild sex lives themselves, they were not very happy.
Huh. Yeah, I just got this. I've mentioned before that I'm a judge for the Los Angeles Times Science Book Awards. So this is the book. I'll just hold it up in case anyone's interested. I've only started reading it, so I can't really give you a summary or a verdict yet. But
well, you know what? what I wanted to, I guess my comment on this is that it reminded me a little bit, there's all this attention being brought to bear on our sex lives. I think a lot of this has to do with baby boomers who want to remain young forever, be athletic and sexy and all that. And the pharmaceutical companies are going to encourage that, especially if they can make billions of dollars off us. And it reminds me of, you remember in Brave New World?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
The government, you were actually encouraged, if not required, to have as much promiscuous sex as possible.
Right.
Which was seen as a way to keep, so sex was almost another opiate.
The opiate of the masses.
Right.
Much less dangerous than religion.
Yes.
Well, yeah, it's like the pursers giving out the grogs of rum on the long sea voyages. You have to have something to distract the masses to keep them from revolting.
Yeah, and
you're not suggesting that that's going on now. I mean,
well, there's something creepy about it.
Part of a repressive conspiracy.
Well, there are some people. There are some scientists, authorities on sexuality, who are saying that there is just a lot of this focus on our sex lives is creating anxiety among some people who would just prefer, especially as they get older, not to have a lot of sex.
Yeah, just to lay back and relax and wear your what is it? Your Snuggie or your
Snuggies are sexy, George.
Okay, enough product placements.
Oh, let me one more comment. There's another story that I clipped. Oh, by the way, the Times also had, it's not just for women, although mostly it's for women. The Times also had a big piece about treatments for male premature ejaculation.
Mm-hmm.
But a serious potential downside, especially of the pharmaceutical, the medical interventions for sexuality, involves estrogen replacement therapy, which really dates back to the 50s. The Times, again, had a big story in December in the business section about these new lawsuits against the manufacturers of the hormone replacement therapy for women, which are prescribed at premenopausally usually, and how now there are these giant class action suits by women who say that they've gotten breast cancer and other medical problems because of taking these drugs.
Yeah.
So.
And now they're suggesting using them for recreational purposes.
Right. Well, sure. That's true of all these products. So they start with a medical application, but then it becomes for enhancement. But this story, I'm going to hold this piece up from the Sunday Times, and there's an ad from the 1950s. So this is when estrogen replacement therapy began. Really, there was a drug called Premarin, which was prescribed back then, and in this ad that's reprinted in this Times story, they show this couple on a boat, and the guy looks disturbingly like Rudy Giuliani, and he's got a woman who's looking at him adoringly. And just listen to this copy from the ad. The physician who puts a woman on Premarin when she is suffering in the menopause usually makes her pleasant to live with once again.
Ooh.
Listen to this. It is no easy thing for a man to take the stings and barbs of business life, then to come home to the turmoil of a woman going through the change of life. If she is not on Premarin, that is.
There must have been a horrible backlash against this commercial. This reminds me of the old Valium commercials from the 60s. It's kind of the Stepford wife syndrome. It's
amazing. I mean, somebody should do a book on what advertisements say about our culture. I imagine that there probably wasn't a backlash against this ad. That it was probably pretty much accepted because that it reflected the standards of the day.
Yeah.
So,
boy.
Anyway, okay, I guess we've beaten that one to death.
Yeah, well, I think on a brighter note, we were going to talk about psychosurgery, right? Or no, not psychosurgery. Or psychosurgery and electroconvulsive therapy.
Yeah, well, this is another kind of trend story.
Yeah, I mean, you sent me that, it was that press release from the Alliance for Human Research Protection.
Yeah.
So it's concerned about the possibility that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, may exempt manufacturers of electroconvulsive therapy devices from the regulatory requirement to prove that their devices are safe and effective through the pre-market approval process.
Yeah, what I found remarkable, I'm actually on the listserv for this organization, the Alliance.
Now, this isn't one of those Scientology groups, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I've known, or I've had a kind of email correspondence with the person who runs this. It's really a one-person shop. It's a woman named Vera Hasner-Sharov, who I think she had a son who had a very adverse reaction to psychiatric drugs a couple of decades ago, and it turned her into this activist watchdog against the pharmaceutical industry and doctors, and especially focusing on psychiatry.
So it's a one-person alliance.
Yeah, but she's really good at digging up information, and she is cited as a source fairly often by reporters in the New York Times and elsewhere. But anyway, I hadn't realized that there was never an FDA approval process for shock therapy.
Huh. That does seem surprising that they would, like with X-ray machines, you would think that you wanted to make sure they were properly calibrated and.
Yeah.
So unless it's the case that the maximum, I don't know, these aren't really producing such huge voltages.
Well, they used to, so the voltages have gone down.
Yeah, but not because of any kind of regulation, you're saying?
Well, so just to give you a little background, I wrote about electroshock. Now it's called electroconvulsive therapy. That's the
right. It's apparently, many psychiatrists say it's amazingly effective in cases where nothing else works, and you have someone who's so depressed they're just basically on the verge of killing themselves.
Yeah. So it was invented in the 1930s by an Italian named Ugo Cerletti, and it was very popular in the 1950s, and then its use declined somewhat as drugs became more popular in mental hospitals.
And there were a few cases of real abuse. It sounds like in state mental hospitals before most of those were depopulated. The really serious schizophrenia wards. Because of the development of antipsychotic drugs. I guess there were cases in some state mental hospitals where they were used as more of a form of punishment and discipline than therapy.
That's right, and that was, of course, depicted in the film the novel by Ken Kesey came out in 1962, right. And then the film, which I think was, late 60s or around 1970, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah,
Jack Nicholson is the troublesome patient, and he got electroshock therapy basically just to, as a way of beating the crap out of him, of punishing him. Punishing
but
him.
It's really the lobotomy that movie's often used as, in anti-electroconvulsive therapy, propaganda, but it was actually. I think a lot of people misremember that it was actually psychosurgery, a lobotomy, right at the end that turned him into a this completely docile, wiped-out creature.
Well, the shock therapy is just... So back decades ago, you got shock therapy while you were awake. There was no anesthesia. And the problem was... So it did make a good form of punishment just by inflicting pain. But it was also, even if you had the most benign intentions, it was very dangerous because the whole purpose is to induce a seizure this way.
Right.
And people would often, the seizures would be so, first of all, it was painful. So it was, people didn't want it for that reason. But the seizures were so violent that people would sometimes, you had to be strapped down, but you'd sometimes crush all your teeth by gnashing
that's
them
all
together.
changed, though.
Yeah, so now you have general anesthesia, and so you're completely knocked out, and they also have a muscle relaxant to prevent the physical convulsions. So I actually saw shock therapy being administered at probably the world's premier shock therapy center at Columbia University. I think this was in 1998 when I was doing research for The Undiscovered Mind, and it was...
it's kind of anticlimactic, right?
It was very anticlimactic. And, I saw people recovering from it afterwards, and some really looked like they were out of it, but then there were others who were talking, the anesthesia only lasts, I think, for 20 minutes or so. And there were some people who were having a coherent conversation very rapidly. And Sackheim said that he couldn't reveal any names, of course, but he said he treated a lot of very prominent celebrities, people in show business in New York. He said he had given shock therapy to people in the morning who then had performed on Broadway that evening.
Wow.
Which is remarkable. And there are, some very prominent advocates of shock therapy, including Dick Cavett, who says that it helped bring him out of
he had a horrible episode of depression.
That's right.
Well, and then there was Thomas Eagleton, remember?
Yeah.
McGovern's running mate for president way back when. Right. But that just shows you the difference, because he basically had to resign his position on the ticket because of the stigma of having received, any kind of psychotherapy.
Right. Well, I guess after looking at all the evidence for shock therapy, I concluded that if I personally was severely suicidally depressed, and severe depression you're psychotic. You can't even get out of bed, and it's really horrible. Completely debilitating. It's devastating for the people around you. And if I had that kind of therapy or that kind of disease, and I wasn't responding to psychotherapy or drugs, I would
go
definitely.
For it.
I think I would if it was the only way to save my life. On the other hand, what Sackheim told me back then, and I think this is still the case, is that the vast majority of people who get shock therapy are only get temporary relief.
Temporary relief,
and they have to keep getting it after that.
Which may be, under some conditions, it may be the best you can hope for.
But there are...
It's sad to think, but it's just so interesting how people react, emotionally to the idea, that you're shocking the brain. Well, if there's some kind of shock therapy, say for, treating a nerve disorder in your leg or some kind of muscular disorder, that's one thing. But the fact of administering electricity to the brain, it just brings up all these old buried cultural images that came out in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And
it is,
And again, it's that idea that this refusal to treat the brain is just another organ. This is the seat of our cells and our soul, and we can't just think of it in the same way, as we do the liver or the kidney.
It reminds me of a quote. I had this in my book about psychosurgery. So the lobotomy was so popular when it was introduced it was actually first introduced by a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz. He won a Nobel Prize for the lobotomy in 1949, and the New York Times ran an editorial saying how wonderful this was, and they said that lobotomizers had, quote, taught us to look with less awe at the brain. It's just a big organ with very difficult and complicated functions to perform, and no more sacred than the liver.
Oh, wow. That was the Times in what year?
That was in 1949.
Yeah. Well, in some ways that's a helpful perspective. I mean,
I don't know, man.
It's simplistic, though, because there's no other organ where the specificity of the tissues is so important. You're actually encoding information, which is, a huge part of its function by these, very specific little neural connections. So you don't have the kind of slack that you presumably have if you're cutting out, some lung or liver and.
Well, here's
the way. Yeah, there was that. There was that story. That was just a couple of months ago by Ben Carey that you reminded me of about people with serious obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Right.
Far beyond restless leg syndrome on TV. That, lives are just completely disrupted, and they've been using psychosurgery to treat this in a few cases.
Yeah, that was really fascinating to me. Again, lobotomies have even more of a public relations problem than shock therapy, probably.
Yeah, maybe more deservedly so, but.
Well, because they were
again,
really.
It's a matter of refinement. I mean, there's nothing, there's no prima facie reason why you would think that you should never consider, doing a surgical procedure to correct a problem of the mind. And again, it's kind of that buried dualism that we have in our society, that the mind is different from the body, and something that's pretty much rejected by mainstream neuroscience, and yet that we all, I think, really still believe on a deep level.
Well, as you say, though, a lot of these reservations come from the revolting history of how these treatments were used. So the lobotomies in this country were popularized by a guy named Walter Freeman, who was the father of the neuroscientist Walter Freeman at UCal.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Wow. Yeah, and Freeman used to he drove across the country in a station wagon. He perfected the what's called the transorbital lobotomy, which involved instead of drilling holes through the skull to reach the part of the brain that you wanted to delete, he found that you could just take basically an ice pick and slip it over the top of the eyeball.
Yeah.
And then stick it into the brain, and then just wiggle it around and destroy the
much
brain
less
tissue.
invasive. Much less invasive.
So
Isaac Newton did something like that.
Did Isaac Newton?
And Isaac Newton did self-experiments where he put a needle, like a blunt needle, between his eye socket and the eye, and then he would wiggle it around and report what kind of cool colors he saw. But he didn't go as deep as Freeman did. Anyway, that was neither.
Freeman he was a real showboat. So he used to like to get two patients, one on either side of him, and he would perform lobotomies on two people at the same time.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people died, had severe brain damage, of course. I agree with you that I think, in principle, there's no reason why the brain can't be treated with surgery and or even electricity. I mean, after all, some of the drugs also can be extremely destructive and have adverse side effects. The way that I look at these old, formerly discredited treatments or treatments with very bad reputations having a comeback is that it says a lot about psychopharmacology, which was supposedly taking us into this brave new world in which mental illness would be easily managed, if not completely cured. And the drugs just really have never been as effective as they have been advertised to be by many people in psychiatry. And,
well, that's true, but I think
that
they have had a huge effect, don't you think? I mean, just the development of the antipsychotics that basically resulted in putting all these schizophrenics in state mental hospitals, out in halfway houses, and sometimes, sadly, ultimately on the street.
Better than nothing.
Yeah,
it's better than nothing. But these drugs like the neuroleptics, they're called for schizophrenia, Thorazine, and all these new generations have severe side effects.
Yeah.
They cause these physically debilitating symptoms. You get kind of lockjaw and your hands. You get a kind of body nervous tic.
Yeah.
Just another.
Yeah, but you have to
story.
weigh all that against the side effects of schizophrenia.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
Which are horrible. So.
Just another story, another news story in this realm. This is very new. This came out just 2 days ago. It's Benedict Carey, the mental health guy from the New York Times, and he's reporting on a big new study of antidepressants,
right.
and it found that except for people with severe depression, antidepressants are no better than placebos, which is remarkable. And I got to say, it's something that I was basically saying in 10 years ago in my book, The Undiscovered Mind, and at that time it was still considered very controversial and sort of a fringe position, but now
I don't know. He's going to get that study is going to result in a huge backlash among many doctors who will come forward and say that's just not their experience, that they've. I mean, you could ascribe it to the placebo effect, I suppose, in every case, but I don't know. I think there's very good evidence that SSRIs really do treat this kind of depression, anxiety disorders.
Well, I mean, the psychoanalysts.
You don't know how they work, really. They have a theory that they work by regulating serotonin production and uptake in the brain, but I guess they haven't really established that that's what they're doing.
Well, the psychoanalysts can say the same thing about old Freudian therapies, that they don't care what the clinical trials say. They know that it helps their patients.
Yeah. I know so many people, though, that really feel they were helped by taking antidepressants. So it's hard to, of course it's anecdotal evidence, but it's very difficult to just write that off, from this study.
Yeah, it's difficult to write that off, but I think, especially if we're talking about if this is put in the context of the debate over health care and what should be paid for with federal money, you've got to go to the clinical trials. You can't go on sort of personal testimony of patients.
Oh no, but all these things were tested in clinical trials, or they wouldn't have been on the market.
Yeah. Oh God, George, that's so naive. Are you kidding? A lot of the clinical trials.
I know what you'll say. Yeah.
All the clinical trials were done by the drug companies that are marketing these drugs. And a lot of the negative clinical trials were just put in a drawer somewhere. That's what we've learned over the last 10, 15 years. So anyway,
the story again to remind myself of the details.
I mean, I think it's good news that for severe depression. But even with severe depression, the way I look at it is, when you're, I was severely depressed. I think probably clinically depressed about 27 years ago. I'd been dating a woman, and she broke up with me, and I was just graduating from college. I didn't know what the hell I was going to do with my life. And anyway, I went into a real tailspin. And in retrospect, I think I was really clinically depressed. And I think I felt so crappy that any change would have been, I would have interpreted it as a good thing. So when it comes to mental health, I think it's not that you're actually better in some quantifiable way. You just feel, if something just makes you feel different, that will be good.
Yeah, and the fact that you've taken some concrete kind of action in order to treat this, but...
Right.
I mean, did you try any kind of therapy? Or?
No, I didn't. I actually, what broke me out of it was
you met someone else.
Was meeting Susie,
my
future wife.
But I mean, you're talking about clinical depression where you were basically unable to get out of bed, and
it wasn't that bad,
or even eat, and I mean that's.
For me, it was more. It was. I had my brain went into these sort of negative cognitive loops. I would just have these really negative thought processes that would just play over and over again, and I
and then you become obsessed by the fact that you're having this process, and that would just make it worse.
Yeah, and so this is how I make sense of something like shock therapy. So the main side effect of shock therapy is that you lose your memory, and I think it works because it sort of, see, if it's the equivalent of like whacking you on the side of the head so hard that you actually forget. It knocks you out of these cognitive loops, and you forget why you were depressed.
Yeah. No, but ever since I was a kid, I've had a certain obsessive compulsive kind of fairly mild, but we're getting into those exact same kind of loops, and usually it would happen if you'd just broken up with a girlfriend,
right,
or just some bad thing where you would just go over and over, and what if only I'd done this instead of that, as if like one tiny little change in your behavior or rewinding history could make you happy now.
Right.
And they're very difficult to break out of. And I can think of 2 times in my life when I really fell into that to a really, really deep extent, and both times managed to break out of it. And the first time, it was just kind of took a long trip to Mexico and was basically able to sort of detach myself from, it was almost like this Zen-like detachment that I experienced. I think I even described this once when we were talking about out-of-body experiences or something, on the beach, of looking at the waves and then trying to not interpret the waves as, some concept, but just get the pure ding and such of the perceptual experience, without any of your conceptual filters. And I remember having this epiphany that, wow, it's my brain and there's nothing that I have to think about. I'm in control, and I gave myself that illusion and enjoyed the rest of the trip. Now, the second time I managed to break out of this, when it was at least as bad, was with taking an SSRI daily.
Okay, so
and it took about 3 months. After about 3 months, and it did nothing. And I just thought, but then you keep reading all these books like listening to Prozac, and you just have to wait. And after like 3 or 4 months, suddenly I just realized, wow. I'm really just enjoying all these little things in a sense that, I hadn't for a long time. And I wasn't getting into these obsessive loops anymore. I would see them coming, like things would still bother me just as much as they always had. Like say there's a dog barking loudly outside your window. But I'd be able to just kind of go, oh, that's annoying. And then just kind of let go of it and move on.
Well,
so,
I'm sure
again,
you realize...
anecdotal evidence, but it just seemed to... So clearly, it was just like someone had taken a pair of scissors in my brain and just, cut these little loops as soon as they formed.
Okay, so the problem there is knowing, depression is so complex, and it's so, it's so multifactorial. It's related to things happening to us, external factors, as well as, when I felt like I was depressed, it started with external factors, but then I felt it really was very much something physiological, something wrong with my brain that became self-perpetuating apart from any external factors. But the problem in ascribing your improvement to the drug is that this is a disease that comes and goes for all sorts of mysterious reasons. And
but if you're taking these for like a few years, and then you're finding that you're not having these kinds of episodes that you used to have, say, every few months, albeit milder, and you really feel like your brain is working in a different sort of way, and I completely accept that could be illusory.
Right. Well, but then again, that's why you need the trials, you need the numbers.
Absolutely, and they ideally should be all done by independent research organizations and not by the drug companies. But that's just true, across the entire spectrum of, the pharmaceutical industry, whether you're dealing with hypertension drugs or anything else.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, maybe this guy, the inventor of the Orgasmatron, will refine that to the extent that we can all just, whenever we're feeling blue, just press a button and feel orgasmic bliss.
Yeah, and still nothing works better than going on a hike or long walk and, getting out there. Hockey.
Pond hockey.
Pond hockey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Hey, I think we've used up our time.
Our allotted time. Yeah. Well, I guess we hit on some substance in there somewhere. So, it's that lull, that post New Year's lull. January is actually kind of a depressing month.
Yeah. That's right. Maybe it was just seasonal affective disorder you had. George.
It could be. Yeah, it could have been. And then, once Groundhog's Day comes, that's the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah,
that's a ways off.
Too.
Oh, I wanted to mention one more thing I was going to plug before we go. I mentioned a few episodes ago that I was writing something, or actually I was interviewed for this book called Secrets of the Lost Symbol, which I'm holding up now, and I just got my free copy. And this is, it's a spin-off book from the Dan Brown novel, The Lost Symbol, which is just thoroughly awful. But, a lot of people really like that, and you do get absorbed in the story. My sister-in-law was reading the novel while we were on the Caribbean boat sailing trip. But anyway, I was interviewed for this book, which is supposed to try to put all this stuff in perspective. The whole story's about a Freemasonic conspiracy that's also involved with noetic science and psychokinesis and all this stuff. So they kind of used me to, as a voice of skepticism. And,
the killjoy.
A killjoy, yeah. I was honored to see that, among my fellow killjoys in the book is Richard Dawkins.
Oh.
And on the other side of the fence, not exactly on the other side of the fence, but other notable names are Karen Armstrong, the
wow.
She's
great,
writer.
Though.
Yeah, she is. And Stephen Johnson, who's no relation to me. But anyway, I just wanted to mention the book because I thought they did a really, really interesting job of putting together all this background information for people who are obsessed with Dan Brown, and hopefully some of it will be a good reminder that the book is just fiction and has a lot of just really silly pseudoscience in it.
Well, you reminded me I was going to do a product placement ad myself. I'm holding up now something called the San Francisco Panorama.
Oh, Eggers thing.
Yeah, it's a one-shot newspaper that was produced by Dave Eggers and the people at McSweeney's, the journal that he founded. Eggers, I met at a party last fall, and he turns out to be kind of like Nicholson Baker in that he's got this great fondness for newspapers, old-fashioned hard copy newspapers.
Books and the printed word.
Yeah,
very refreshing to see in a a young man.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, no, he's an impressive force.
So
So you're in that, huh?
Yeah, so I wrote something for this, and it's huge. It's the size of. It's even bigger than the New York Times Sunday Times is these days.
Wow.
And it's got a lot of amazing stuff in it, especially some wonderful investigative journalism on the environmental effects of marijuana farms in California, the drought in California, which is being exacerbated, many people think, by global warming. It's got a wonderful book review section. It's got a review of the World Series between the Phillies and the Yankees by Stephen King. I mean, it's really it's really cool.
Great. And you can't read it online, right? You have to get it on paper.
Yeah, you can cool. You can go to the McSweeney's website, or you can order it from Amazon. And I highly recommend it. I don't know if I think Eggers is hoping to inspire more interest, especially among young people, in classic hard copy journalism, newspaper style journalism.
Yeah.
I hope
he has those literacy groups too that are really great.
Yeah. Right.
But here's the here's the acid test. Did you get paid to write for it?
I am being paid more than I get for blogging heads. But it was
infinitely more.
It was definitely a labor of love for me.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, if you could develop something like this to, where You're getting, we're getting old-fashioned magazine rates.
No, forget that.
No. Dollar a word or less?
Less than $1 a word.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. So anyway, I think it sounds like a great, noble experiment, and I hope
it really is.
Keeps doing these things. And
yeah.
All
right, man.
Well, John, it was great talking to you as always.
Yeah, same here, and Happy New Year. I'll talk to you again in a few weeks.
Very good. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.